Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. In the 75 years since the creation of the Arab League, which grew from 6 members to 22, the Arab countries of North Africa, the Levant, and the Persian Gulf areas have never acted as a unified bloc, except at times against Israel. Now with Iran and Jihadist groups as their mortal enemies, Israel at peace with Egypt and Jordan, as well as normalizing its relations with the United Arab Emirates, the conflicting interests of the various Arab countries are expressed in their alliances with each other and with non-Arab regional and global actors. To better understand the intra-Arab dynamic, we're joined from Jerusalem by Dr. Mordechai Nisan, who is a retired lecturer on Middle East Studies at Hebrew University, Jerusalem. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Also joining today's panel from a suburb of Jerusalem, Ma'ale Adumim, is Professor Hillel Frisch, who is a senior researcher at the Begin Sadat Center at Bar Ilan University. Welcome.
Hi.
And with me in the studio is our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and I'd like to immediately dive into today's topic. Give us a better overview, or a broader overview, if you will, vis-a-vis intra-Arab relations and the background of those relations.
So there has never really been an Arab alliance. There were several Arab alliances, usually at war with each other or in conflict with each other. There were, of course, some attempts at pan-Arabism, especially during Nasser's time, some attempts at unification, which usually was forced on the weaker parties, such as the United Arab Republic, the 3 years that Syria was really under Egyptian domination. But what is happening recently is that there are no ambitious Arab leaders either willing or able to expand their influence over wide areas outside of their home countries. We do have leaders who are concerned about their immediate vicinity, about their neighborhood. So you see the Lebanese and the Syrians concerned about each other. You see Egypt regarding Libya, much as it used to be concerned about Sudan. It may also be concerned about Ethiopia because of the waters of the Nile. And you have Saudi Arabia concerned about Yemen. And all of these countries are concerned about Iran and Turkey, which are Muslim but not Arab, and Israel, which was originally an outcast in the eyes of all of the Arab countries, perhaps with the exception of Transjordan, because Transjordan under King Abdullah I reached a secret agreement with Prime Minister Ben-Gurion to divide the state of Palestine, which did not come into being. Right now, Israel, you mentioned the normalization with the UAE, perhaps other countries in the Gulf will follow. Israel is accepted as a fact on the ground. And when the Arab countries consider whether they are going to have an alliance with Israel or fight it, usually countries such as Jordan and Egypt and others will decide favorably that Israel should be part of an alliance.
Indeed. Professor Frisch, I'd like to refer the next question to you. To what degree is Israel's normalization or rapprochement with the Arab world a significant milestone and somewhat of a hyphen or a projection of a growing shift within the Arab world in which we see more and more separate blocs, if it is the bloc of Saudi Arabia with the United Arab Emirates and such, if we see Qatar siding with Turkey over close sentiments vis-a-vis the Muslim Brotherhood organization and its own ideology. And then, of course, we see other countries in the region that try to maintain more of a neutrality or a vessel perception. If it is Syria forced to be backed by Iran in order to survive because of its religious affiliation to the Shiite Islam and so on. Is this now a transformation of the Middle East that came into fruition just recently, or is this still an ongoing projection from the 2011 so-called Arab Spring?
I think that it is a projection of the so-called Arab Spring, in the sense, I think the most startling phenomena about this unfolding peace between Israel and the UAE is that there's no Arab street protesting it. Instead, the Arab street is protesting either the Arab regimes themselves, or even more so, the Iran and its violent proxies. I'm sure that Arab regimes, the Sunni Arab regimes, are taking note of this lack of the Arab street, their silence in the face of treason against the Palestinian cause, and this is going to prod them even more to normalize relations with Israel. Saying that, there's a limit to how much Israel can ally with these Arab states, and that is due to the Intra-Arab differences. So Qatar, which perceives Saudi Arabia as being the major threat, will not be part of that normalization process, although it deals with Israel regarding Hamas. Syria can't be part of that deal because part of the getting close to Israel amongst the Sunni pragmatic states is a common sense of threat from Iran, and the North African states are simply too distant to want to even normalize relations, given the sensitivities that do exist amongst their publics to such a thing. It's simply not worthwhile from their part to enter that process. Indeed. So I think that we're talking about Israel and the Gulf states, Sudan. I mean the immediate area, excluding Syria and Qatar. But there's no doubt that this is a tremendous change. Basically, Syria is the pariah state, and not Israel, and that's of course a vast sea change from what existed 50 years ago, for example.
Dr. Nisan, your perception on this?
The background to much of what has been transpiring is Iran, the 1979 revolution in Iran, and it's being exported around the region and creating what's called the Shiite Crescent, has basically upset any kind of sense of an Arab order in the Middle East. The Arab world, composed of whatever number of states, is in total disarray and upheaval since then, if not before, but certainly since then. The Iranian Islamic Revolution, coupled with Egypt's peace treaty with Israel, and therefore Egypt kind of exiting from the Arab world for at least a temporary period of time, and Iran threatening the Arab world at the same time, really changed the rules of the game in the Middle East, and particularly the Arab world has been pushed back to political atomization. There's no Arab unity. There's no sense of an Arab nation. There's no real glue to bind them together for any common action. And therefore, the decomposition, so to speak, of the Arab world puts the Arab world in a position of every state for itself. And therefore, the idea of building alliances or alignments among Arab states is dependent on immediate state interests. And this is what we see now with the United Arab Emirates. It has nothing to do with Arab nationalism. It has ostensibly little to do with Islam. It has to do with a state pursuing its own interests. And the Arab world has been reduced to this, which in a way is a very healthy development, because the older ideological idea of Arab nationalism and Arab unity was really a false idea, which was never grounded in anything that bound the Arabs together. And some of the Arabs are hardly even Arabs, as it were. And therefore, what is happening, in a way, is a positive development for them, though they may not look at it that way, or not all of the Arabs look at it that way. But it's a positive development in terms of each state concerned about its own sovereignty, its own policy, its own regime survival, in respect of which that, from the Israeli point of view, opens up opportunities.
Indeed. Mr. Oren, I'd like to understand, to what degree do you think that the Palestinian question, which for years was a domestic issue for many Arab countries in the region, where a vast population of tens of thousands and sometimes even hundreds of thousands of Palestinians would alter the domestic political standing of several countries, if it is Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and so on. Now that the Arab Spring came along in 2011 and made a shift, and different components within the different regimes had to deal suddenly with a new reality at hand, it seems like they're less interested specifically in the Palestinian issue, but rather in establishing a certain stability. Also, of course, as Dr. Nisan stated, the Iranian question is very much at hand, being concerned about proxy wars and malign influences of different sorts. How do you see this actually coming into play today?
So the answer is all of the above, plus more. All of the above because, yes, there are so many more millions of refugees and displaced persons who are not Palestinians, that the plight of the poor refugees and their offspring, now even grandchildren and perhaps fifth generations, this is of less concern to other Arabs who are in a more desperate position than the Palestinians, who get support from UNRWA or other international organizations, and who have upset the demographic composition of host countries such as Lebanon and Jordan. The other factor is what you mentioned regarding Iran. A country such as the United Arab Emirates fears Iran more than it fears Palestinian reprisal. The Saudis used to be extorted by the Palestinians. They used to pay Hamas so that Hamas would not perform its terror activity against the House of Saud, but rather somewhere else, against Israel and other places. But there is also another answer, and that is that the Palestinians were not completely forgotten. It all started with the peace with Egypt. And here we are, we mentioned the Begin Sadat Institute at Bar Ilan. It started with Sadat, who had his separate peace with Begin, but nevertheless insisted on some progress on the Palestinian front. The autonomy talks, of course, Sadat was assassinated before it came into any fruition. And that is what all Arab regimes would say. Whatever is acceptable to the Palestinians would be acceptable to me. We are not going to be more Catholic than the Pope being Palestinian, a Muslim in this case. And by the way, even Saddam Hussein, I remember an address by Saadun Hamadi, one of his henchmen, in Washington in the mid-'80s. When Saddam was courted because he was against Iran. He said, whatever the Palestinians will sign with Israel would be acceptable by us. We are not going to fight their fight if they are willing to have peace with Israel. So we saw that this peace with the UAE was conditioned upon Benjamin Netanyahu's suspending, freezing, or really shelving the annexation dreams.
Indeed. Is it truly so, Professor Frisch, that we're at a new juncture when we're talking about the handling of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, considering that we see also just recently there was a summit in Amman, the capital of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, where we saw the Prime Minister of Iraq, the President of Egypt, and the King of Jordan join together, discussing, of course, variables of the Arab world. And while the king was providing his opening statement, within his remarks, he said that even though the Palestinians are a crucial point of discussion for them, they talk more specifically about the whole story that has to do with food security and domestic issues, as those countries are really challenged right now, not only with economic challenges that have been there for quite some time, but also with the ramifications of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, and of course with more of a reluctance from rich countries to immediately rush to the aid of weaker countries, considering their own domestic woes. How do you see this now impact the Arab world, which is very much reliant on Western money rather than Saudi money or UAE money for that matter?
This is, Patrick Moynihan was a famous senator and no less a famous Harvard professor. And he famously said, all politics are local. And in mature democracies, that is indeed the case. The publics want domestic social welfare at home more so than any involvement in international affairs. And despite globalization, this has remained true. The Arab publics are maturing in very much the same way. When I first studied Arabic, all the headlines were about external affairs, especially the Palestinians. And just year after year, the Arab publics became more focused on domestic concerns. And this reached a tremendous point in the so-called Arab Spring, where the Palestinian issue was no longer an issue. They wanted accountable government. And this is the growing process. This is a process of maturity, and I agree with my fellow colleagues that the idea that every state is acting on its own is a part of a maturation process that characterized also European politics and South American politics. So in general, the Palestinian issue could no longer be that important because they are. You see it today. Arab publics are not protesting the UAE Israeli peace process.
Well, not in all cases,
the
because
normalization
we see in Jordan
process. They're protesting. They're protesting against states or against foreign states meddling in their affairs.
Well,
so
we could see, though, Professor
Frisch, this is really a long-term phenomenon.
Professor Frisch, we could see, though, significant protests in Jordan, where there is a big Palestinian community there, above 50%. Some say 60, 70, or even more. We saw protests in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon. But those protests were, of course, initiated by local Palestinian communities that are, of course, still very much hopeful to see a certain return, the right of return, whatever they call that, in trying to be part of a certain agreement where you'll see an influx of what are the descendants of former refugees that used to live here on the land.
But the last big demonstration, pro-Palestinian demonstrations amongst Palestinians in Jordan was in 1989. Since then, most of the demonstrations that have taken place in Jordan have taken place in the south, in the undeveloped Bedouin south. And one of the reasons being that there was no longer an expansion of the army since the 1970s. And meanwhile, the youthful population was growing and they had no employment. But the Palestinians have ceased being a destabilizing element in Jordanian society, which allows the Jordanian king to do almost nothing about the Palestinian issue. So the Palestinians realize that the UAE is going to take the same route as the European Union. Lots of hype, lots of support, social welfare support for Palestinians. But when push comes to shove, they're going to do preciously little to achieve
the only exception
Palestinian goals.
The only exception to what Professor Frisch recounts is Jerusalem. If Jerusalem, Al-Aqsa, becomes controversial again through some action, then you see Jordan rising to the occasion.
Dr. Nisan, do you see the question of Jerusalem being a religious question for Muslims, the core for a intra-Arab consensus vis-a-vis Israel? We, of course, can't not but also touch on the fact that Saudi Arabia, as opposed to the other countries that see Israel in a more favorable way, came out and said, yes, we're willing to normalize relations with Israel maybe in the future, so long as the Palestinian issue is resolved. How do you see this actually play into question?
I want to mention in this context the role of President Trump in his foreign policy, his global policy, because the idea that the Palestinian issue, as Netanyahu pointed out, does not have a veto on Israeli-Arab relations is really a consequence of Trump's policy, just as we might say that the Israeli government under Netanyahu for the last 11 years basically put the Palestinian issue into political freeze. Trump did the same thing, meaning the sidelining, marginalization of the Palestinian issue has opened up opportunities for the Middle East between Israel and the Arabs. And therefore, we learn here about the fact that the Palestinians really have lost their political influence. And even though, as Amir says, you never know what could happen when the Jerusalem issue arises or explodes, and that can somehow, change the whole scene and have the Arabs or the Muslims again realign and unite in some fashion against Israel. But barring that, even though I wouldn't bar that as a certitude, but barring that nonetheless, the issues of Jerusalem, Islamic issues, at the moment are off the table. For the moment, off the table, meaning we're not in a situation of resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and therefore that issue is skirted. And meanwhile, Israel is able to establish reasonable ties, visible and invisible, public and not so public, with a number of Arab countries. In respect of which, I think we should understand that the Palestinians have not proven to be able to be a political entity of any significant weight. Their story is, on a human level, a sad story, apropos refugees and the like. But their vision of establishing themselves as an effective political actor, going back to, let's say, the 60s and 70s, has proved vacuous. They never succeeded to do that. And even when they seemed to do that, as was mentioned before, in terms of the autonomy talks between Israel and Egypt and what have you, all of that really was on the surface. There was never really a grappling with the issue between Israel and the Palestinians. And therefore, all of this really presents a certain scenario whereby Israel has been able to basically move forward politically, not to say the situation on the ground has been resolved in any sense, it hasn't, but Israel has been able to move forward politically, skirting the Palestinian issue, leaving them out in the political cold. And the Arabs have been willing somehow to go along with that because of their own domestic needs. And we're coming back to what maybe most of us have said here this evening. Each regime is concerned about its welfare. And if the Syrian regime is in havoc and the Iraqi regime is faltering and Lebanon is a failed state, with this kind of background, the Persian Gulf states look very reasonably stable and prosperous. The North African countries, whatever level of failed regimes they represent or not, But all of this tells us that the core of the Arab Middle East, which is the Fertile Crescent, Syria and Iraq, maybe Jordan, has proved to be politically irrelevant. In respect of which, the Palestinian question has also become politically irrelevant, as I say. But again, I would only comment as an addendum to what I'm saying now, is that, as we know, in the Middle East, you must expect the unpredictable. You can't predict what will happen. And so regimes which look stable today and committed to their particular foreign policy, like the UAE,
Indeed.
And we wish them a long and healthy life for the regime, for the Sultanate. But again, somebody who is up today may be down tomorrow, and somebody who's down today may be up tomorrow. So you have to be very vigilant, and I think that's the message that we should all remember, even though we tend to romanticize the Israel-UAE rapprochement, which is not unreasonable to romanticize it. But again, this is the Middle East.
Indeed. Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, so I'd like to have a closing statement from you, Mr. Oren, as we don't have enough time to hear all of the analysis from everyone, and to bring also Turkey into the picture and the East Med pipeline. To what degree do you see, considering the fact that we see more of an involvement with the UAE into the picture, with Saudi Arabia and Egypt, of course, in Libya, also in the face of the whole story, we see also the UAE sending aircraft in order to make a joint exercise with the Greek, and of course the Israeli rapprochement with Abu Dhabi. Everything together seems to play out in one direction, where we have suddenly a new camp in the horizon.
Yes, we have the financial considerations. You mentioned the pipeline. It means that Egypt wants to play along with Israel, Cyprus, Greece, and Italy. It looks after its own interests. Libya is another case. It's a failed state, and it means that dictators like Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, when they go, there is nothing to replace them.
Indeed. Well, this is all the time that we have for today, and there are plenty of other points we need to raise in the near future, and we will do so in our future programs. But I'd like to thank Dr. Nisan, Professor Frisch, as well as Mr. Oren for being in today's panel, and I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.